It would seem on the surface that an easy answer to the question of what's the ultimate source for Christian morality would be God's commands, since they are so numerous, and we're just taught to obey God's commands as the fundamental criterion for morality. But if you think about that a little bit more clearly, I think the answer to that ultimately is no. That God's commands, we would say, are a penultimate source, not the ultimate source for morality. The ultimate source for morality in a Christian ethic is God's character. And because God is the kind of God that He is, that explains why we have the commands that we do. For example, the reason that God commands that we love our neighbor is not because love makes the world go round, though it does. Ultimately, the reason for that is because God is that kind of a God. God commands that we be forgiving people fundamentally, not because forgiveness heals fractured relationships, though that's a great outcome of that, but it's ultimately because God is fundamentally a forgiving God. And the difficulty, I think, with grounding Christian morality in God's commands is that you make yourself vulnerable to what we write about in chapter 2 of the book as what's classically known as the Euthyphro Dilemma. And though that was a question originally posed to the ancient Greeks about their pantheon of gods, it's often been applied to any type of morality that's dependent on God's commands, be it from Christianity or Judaism or Islam. And that is, does God command things because they are good? Okay? And if that's true, that would seem to make God's commands redundant. Or are things good because God commands them, which would put you at risk of God being capricious or arbitrary, such that, if God commands that we torture babies for fun and profit, then that's what's moral. Okay? Now, most people would, when they answer that latter part, are things good because God commands them, they would say, no, not really, because there are certain things that God's not capable of commanding. Right? To say that, if God commands that we torture babies for fun and profit, the common response to that is that, well, a loving, caring, compassionate God would never command that. By making that counter argument, what you're suggesting is that God's commands are indeed not the ultimate source for morality. What you're suggesting is that it's God's character that is the ultimate grounding for morality and provides the limits and parameters around what God can command. Now, we also defend in this idea, in this chapter, the idea of natural law, that God reveals moral values outside the pages of Scripture, and so what God commands in the pages of Scripture has to be consistent with what God has revealed in terms of natural law. And the Scripture is very clear that the door is open for God to reveal His moral values outside the pages of Scripture, so that He commands things in His Word. He also reveals those moral values in His world. To give you an example of natural law, I used to volunteer in my kids' elementary school classes, and in our school district we have what's called a Character Counts campaign, and they take a different character trait and highlight it every month. When I first walked into my son's, I think it was a second grade classroom, all around the ceiling or of the top wall of the classroom were these moral maxims like play fair, don't cheat, be kind, be forgiving. And they were all the things that they wanted to communicate about morality to elementary school kids. And I remember walking into that wondering, well, who decided that those were the moral values that we wanted to communicate to those kids? How did we reach a consensus on that? And I suspect what happened was there was a lot of discussion, and they reached consensus about those specific moral values. And what they've discovered is that those are consistent with a lot of the moral values in plenty of other cultures too. And I recognized at that point that that's probably not an accident. And the reason there's consensus about those moral values, not only in our school district, but in most other cultures, is because there's a reservoir of shared values because God has communicated moral values not only in His Word, but also in His world to so that people who don't have access to the Bible are accountable for obeying those moral standards that have been revealed in God's world.